They are a Ph.D. student at the Department of General Linguistics here in Olomouc. Their research focuses on the linguistic expression of genderqueer and gender non-binary individuals in the Czech LGBTQ+ community, and the issue of divorcing gender expression from gender binarity. Their talk will be the role of language in the social and historical construction of queer gender identities. So yeah, please, Miriama.
So we might have to figure out if we can hear me.
I think that should be good as long as you really project.
Yeah. Like this then. Can I just maybe get a confirmation from somebody online that we can hear me, maybe?
Try again.
Something, words, some saying words.
There are some common
Okay, good. The words appear to.
Let us know if at any point you cannot hear Miriama.
Okay, so well, hello everyone. Oh Lord, door. Okay, so hello, my name is Miriam. I'm currently doing research on the options and concrete execution of gender neutral language in Czech. And in my master's thesis there, I also dealt with deconstructing gender in semiotics. And the reason why I consider this, that my work, nice. I consider this field of research quite important is that I feel like that a lot of research that is done on queer language and gender neutral language comes from English speaking researchers that I feel like we might be missing some important problems or like holes in the research that are very language specific. Since in English, a lot of linguistic gender expression is reduced solely to a choice of pronouns or only becomes a problem when addressing people in third person, when speaking to them when it comes to affirming gender identity through communication. And there are a lot of language-specific minutiae that can be studied that differ across languages, not only in Slavic languages and Romance languages, but also other language-specific problems like in Japanese, where you can deal with, there's a lot of studies that have been done on the use of first-person pronouns that Japanese has a whole lot of, some of them not even gender-specific. And yeah, basically, how does one translate the expression of an identity that defies the grammatical binary if it is technically not replicable or not possible in the target language? Can I please get a slide? Thank you. Oh, it is not working. Thank you. So some choice memes that we can produce. So just like skip to the important parts so that we do not have to door distracts me every time. So we do not have to argue definitions of gender, because I'm sure that everyone who has stepped foot on Twitter in recent months is probably pretty fed up with that. But so let's just say that for the purpose of this presentation, we'll be treating sex and gender as two concepts that are entwined and interact with each other, however, are not essentially and prescriptively linked. And we'll be treating gender identity as a social construct expressed on a three-dimensional spectrum, and sex as a separate bimodal spectrum of characteristics. So there are a few important things that should be pointed out first, and that is that while we can look at gender expression from kind of two directions, one that centers individual intention and one that centers social performance. That does not mean that gender roles or gender language or gender expression or gender stereotypes are what constitutes gender. If you could maybe give me the other slide, thank you. Yeah, so I personally like to define gender through John Searle's theory of social institutions and also speech acts. So the concept of the social institution in this context exists as the result of collective intentions in society, so the we intention, and objective social reality is created by the sum of collective intentions, which essentially means that gender as a concept is real specifically because society intends it to be so and enforces it to be so, which is why it is also historically and geographically constructed in different ways. Things that are often brought up as examples of social institutions are things like employment and private property and more obvious things like government and police. But we have to also include the obvious social constructs such as gender and race that also fall under social institutions. Well, gender technically also counts as a legitimate legal institution because it is not only legally enforceable, but legally enforced in a lot of avenues of life. Then there is also the problem of centering the performance of gender identity or one's place in society, which is a little cramped in here. For which I like to often fall on the theory of gender as a social performance that was proposed by Julie Butler, where we can kind of use it to anchor gender and gender expression in a historical concept as it is entwined with sexuality partially, because for a rather long time, both gender and sexuality would be treated historically not really as something that somebody is, but more as something that somebody does. So, which is why we can observe historically that often things like homosexuality were treated not as sexuality, but something like defying one's gender identity, because the heterosexual social contract is technically part of gender identity and in this context, which is why it is partially important to in my opinion, to center the intention of the individual when it comes to expressing a gender identity, because if we center specific performance or specific adherence to certain gender roles, and then we try to expand this to transgender people or gender non-conforming or gender variant people, we run into pitfalls such as the fact that a man puts on a dress does not yet mean that he identifies as a woman if he declares that he doesn't, right? Which is where speech acts come into question or into it, because mostly when we think of performative or declarative speech acts, we may think of something like the declaration of marriage or sentencing in court or the verdict of something. But I would personally argue that while it is simple and common utterance, just speaking in a specific gendered language is technically a declarative act of like continuously reaffirming an adherence to a certain gender, at least when it simply comes to language. which is one of the reasons that one of the ways that we might actually define gender, where I like, it's a question that you see on the internet all the time these days. What is a woman? And I like to say that we can no better define a woman than we can a chair, because technically, if you define a chair a very specific way, it is in fact a horse. And most definitions that one may come up with when it comes to defining women will exclude at least some women, often women that they are not looking to exclude. So a very simple definition of a woman being a person who tells me that they are a woman is not without flaw either. I suppose it falls well within the Act of Speech Act, even though we even if we rely on intention, we cannot specifically control for lies. So somebody might declare themselves something and not mean it, but can I get another slide, please? Thank you. Yeah. So this is specifically here because I need to demonstrate the concept. This is from my earlier work when I was trying to place gender and biological sex on two semiotic squares. And then I needed to figure out a way for these two things to interact. So if you would give me the next slide, please. I ended up joining them in a cube, because this is technically just like two semiotic squares that interact on a 3D plane. Why this is here is that while we technically would probably like to divorce talk of gender identity from biological sex, this is more possible in some languages, less possible in others. And why the semiotic squares, or rather the cube model in this instance, is a little important is specifically the concept of the non-man and the non-woman, which will be important later when we talk about non-binary gender expression in Czech specifically. I also feel it is important to point out that while like systematizing the interaction of gender identity and biological sex, it is not prescriptive. So what we can try and identify it as a system, but adherence to any outlined identities is not mandatory and does not speak to the validity of a lived experience of any individual. Okay, so it's not just imposing another system. As we know, the gender roles and stereotypes do not constitute what gender is. However, as we have seen on the meme from before, can you maybe click for the other meme?
Go back?
No, just click. No, just, yes, thank you. My other meme. As is apparent from our memes, we live in a society, so even a rejection of a certain system might only exist on the background of said system, because even the act of a rejection of something exists on the backdrop of it, which is why I've included the visualization of what it feels like when you're trying to get rid of the gender binary in your analysis of the interaction of varying non-conventional gender identities with the biological sex, and so it tosses out the gender binary and then it crawls back in through the window in the back. One often complained result of this systematizing of the gender identity system is the accidental creation of the so-called gender trinary, in which non-binary individuals often report that they feel socially pressured to conform to a certain way of androgynous expression, to feel like they are performing their valid new chosen gender role, which is something that they were in the first place trying to break away from. Another slide, please. Thank you. So, finally, the problem of non-conventional gender expression in Czech. So, as a Slavic language, Czech is highly gendered in all aspects of speech, not only in pronouns. And one of the main problems is that the grammatical gender of objects and other things is entirely arbitrary. However, when it comes to applying gender at humans, or well, people and individuals, this arbitrariness disappears, and in fact, it becomes exceptionally rigid and hierarchically enshrined. Now, why does that matter? If we can consider gender among objects to be entirely arbitrary, why would we not apply it arbitrarily to humans? Why does it matter whom expresses what, which way? Which is how we go back to the concept of the institutions and the meme from the start. We live in a society. Gender becomes irrelevant if one only stands in the woods with no one to interact with. There might be some inherent personal feeling, but since there exists no communication or no interaction, technically it does not matter as much as it would in an interpersonal interaction. So why does the gender of the linguistic gender then matter? It is specifically because of human interaction and societal interaction. One pretty prominent problem when it comes to discussing gender and gender identities in Czech is the lack of specific terms, because while it might sound a little bit like something regarding newspeak out of an Orwellian book, it is very hard to discuss something that you do not quite have the language for. So in Czech, it is then quite difficult to even talk about the issue of sex and gender when all language that we have to speak about it is entirely borrowed. Since in Czech, the words male and female are never really applied to humans, and the word female and the word woman is kind of synonymous when it applies to a human person. Fortunately, it seems that we might be able to borrow terms that are pretty commonly used in English discussions that rely on assigned sex at birth, so AFAB, AMAP, those. Which also leads into the problem of why I talk about constructing an identity when it comes to talking about the genderqueer identities in Czech, as it's not really about the constructing the identity itself, but something like trying to reconstruct or translate an existence that makes more sense in a certain language, let's say in English, and trying to translate something that is untranslatable, that being a lived experience, into a language that does not quite allow for it, which brings us back to the problem of the cube and the interaction of the biological sex with or the assigned sex with the gendered language, because the intersection might not be that important or that apparent in English, but in Czech, there are certain linguistic challenges that explicitly relate to it, such as it is we've been doing a little bit of research with active users of non-binary language in Czech, and what is coming out of the research is that it seems to be quite a common way in Czech to construct neutral language kind of across the axis of the visual ostensive characteristics versus the linguistic, because for people who are assigned female at birth, it seems quite a viable, easy to execute linguistic strategy to speak in male language, which then constructs some sort of androgyny across the line of a feminine looking person or one who can be unfortunately socially guesstimated to be assigned female at birth, who speaks in male terms, which is what the concept of the non-woman describes, because it is often described as if neither is not an option, then the opposite will do, which is what leads to this opposite use of the opposite linguistic gender. Since if neither is not an option, as I've mentioned, there is specific, next slide, please, thank you. There is a specific problem with like grammatical neuter in Czech, that being that while it does exist, it carries certain connotations that are not really positive. So as it is not really ever applied to adult humans, only to children or animals or objects, it is possible to speak this way. And I have done recordings with somebody who speaks this way. It is possible, but often reported that it feels for other users who are to speak to that person, that it feels somewhat dehumanizing, as it is not truly like a human-centric neutral language, such as the use of the pronoun they in English. It is almost quite literally an it, and reads as an it, which is a common way to dehumanize gender variant people in other languages, so not quite kosher. But since I spoke earlier of the problem or the issue of arbitrariness in grammatical gender, there is a viable strategy that could be applied, which is attempting to highlight the arbitrariness of male and female grammatical gender in language when applied to humans, just swapping it every which way to maybe try and propagate this among other people. But there is always this problem of wider acceptance of all these proposed language strategies, is that in an English-speaking society, all that you are trying to push through when you are attempting to propagate or promote a sort of inclusive language is maybe one extra pronoun or some exclusive neopronouns. But in Czech, you have to go the distance and do the full language game and just overhaul the entire way of talking, which might be easy to sell to somebody who is already affirming and quite willing to try and adopt this. But since it requires quite a mental load to try and execute, it's not really suitable for wider use. Other problems that I haven't even gotten to, which once again, where once again we are getting to the interaction of gender identity with biology or perceived assigned sex, is that since Czech has cases, and as all Slavic languages do, there are problems even with names. In an English-speaking context, if you choose a neutral sounding name that isn't something like a John or an Erica, but let's say something like Taylor as an example. This name, once it is gender neutral, it will stay gender neutral in any context that you use it in, since you do not have to change it in any way. There's no cases you don't have to decline it. But in Czech, even if you choose a name that does not contain any gender markedness, when you are actually using it in language, you have to decline it, which means that you have, since there are no true neutral name in Czech, nothing that is used in grammatical neuter, you have to choose between male and female. And that means that if you simply choose to not decline the name whatsoever, it will behave grammatically as a female name, which means that if an assigned female person does not decline their name in speech, technically they are signaling femaleness, which is something different for them than it would be for a person who is assigned male at birth, which is almost a problem that technically cannot even be solved when it comes to the name specifically. Then after first names, we have last names, which in most Slavic languages are gendered. They have a male form, they have a female form. And while laws are permitting lately for women to use the neutral, more the male version of the last name, there is still a very definite gender markedness, because in English, one last name is neutral for everyone under all circumstances. In Czech, if you are a woman who uses male neutral name, you are signaling something very specific. Then there is the neutral version of last name that is used specifically for people who are in transition. But that is not the same as the male version of the last name. It is a specific neutral version of the last name. So unlike in English, where the last name is already neutral and you technically committed a non-action in making it neutral, in Czech, you have to take it and change it to make it neutral, signaling a very specific thing of being in transition, or of signaling the third gender or the neutral gender that is used mostly only for people who use that on purpose. It's not generally applicable to full society. And yeah, the last issue is that I have already outlined before, is that with the high English proficiency among young people lately, is that now they acquire the language options sooner to really like interrogate and construct a very solid sense of their identity, which is quite sad. And then they can use this in an English context on the internet, right? But then they have to walk out into Czech society, and they have to try and somehow translate or translate an experience that is very easy to express in one language and nearly impossible to express in this one, because in Czech you cannot escape continuous gender declaration, not even only in communication. The problem is that gender is not only expressed in third person, not only in second person, but also in first person all the time. So technically you do not even have to be communicating with anybody to have to realize your identity or express it somehow, even to yourself within your own thoughts. And yeah, it's a very complicated problem. If by the way, if you would like to learn more about like the concrete strategies for non-binary language in Czech, Vít is his name, I think. He recently released an article in Gender and Language that gets into the specific strategies of non-binary language in Czech and also how it's accepted in popular discourse. And yeah, probably what I can. Yes, so thank you. Questions?
Yes, indeed.
Jesus.
Questions?
I was worried it would come to this.
That's great. I'm sure. Okay, so we have one question here, then one question online, but for Connor, please.
Can I just ask him here?
You wanna come up here? Yeah.
All right, they might want to hear you over there.
Yeah. So I'm curious, given that gender is rather inescapable in Czech,
Yes.
I'm curious, are there any proposed, I guess, movements or changes to the Czech language to kind of escape that binary? Or are we just trying to find ways to navigate it within the current Czech grammar?
Yeah, so first we probably have to nitpick how do you mean proposed. Somebody somewhere has invented it, counts as proposed.
Mhm.
Okay, yes. We have varying ways trying to get around it, but honestly, it does usually mostly exist on the background of the already existent binary/trinary system, where there's, as I mentioned, the arbitrarizing of the male and female language, but that is within the binary. Then there is speaking in the grammatical neuter, so ono sem bylo, někam jsem šlo, which is probably the easiest to execute because it requires the least thinking. Then there is attempting to talk around any gendered constructions, which that tends to work pretty well until you run into a phrase that genuinely cannot be talked around. Then you can, especially in close-knit communities of solely bilingual or multilingual speakers, you can just give up and fall into English or substitution of English phrases where it cannot be talked around. But I've also encountered some newly invented ways, such as endings with an E at the end. So one, chtěle, stuff like that. And it's a little bit feels like playing within an unsolvable problem. Complicated.
Thank you very much.
So, hopefully that answered your question at least partially.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Let's take Veronica. Veronica, can you?
Are you there, Veronica?
Yeah. You spoke about translating the identity within a personal space, but I wanted to ask if any of your research has gone into how the translation is going on more global or general way, because I feel like sometimes in Czech media, when they are attempting to talk about somebody from an English-speaking country who uses who uses they them or some neopronouns, the translation into Czech is sometimes very awkward, even if the translators are actually trying. So have you, is there any research going into how to solve that in general?
Not something I have done, but I've encountered, I only remember the last name of the person who wrote it. It's Wele with the W, who wrote, I think, the master's thesis that specifically researched translating gender non-binary language in English, so they them and such, in literature and polled some people on which they preferred or which they would like best. So there's that, but any wider social propagation of how to go about that, because yes, I've noticed the same thing. They don't tend to quite know how to go about it. But yeah, no. Sorry.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions here or online?
Or this strategy of the card.
Okay, so there is one comment.
Okay.
No, it's actually a question.
Okay. While everyone's busy with drinks, I'm sure I can answer it.
The question is about the neutral name.
Uh-huh.
It says this neutral name is used during transition, but only as a transitional name.
Yes.
Later, the name is changed to the binary option, right?
Yes.
Okay.
It's not meant to be a final thing, which is a bit unfortunate.
Okay. Yes.
So I'm kind of not familiar to this part of the culture, of Czech culture. For example, as you mentioned, like there's the problem of it or they when you use the neutral pronunciation. And based on your observations, how do normally non-binary people feel like when they use neutral pronunciation? Do they feel like it's quite in a comforting way, or is it kind of artificial, like since also it means it, you know what I mean? Is it really satisfactory for them in general? Like
it depends,
Uh-huh.
because when it comes to using, like talking to non-binary identified individuals, usually it's quite common social etiquette to ask them how they would like to be referred to. And if somebody is using this neutral language, it usually means that they are comfortable with it because they chose to use it. So in that case, yes, it would be quite comforting to them. What's almost ironic is that it is other people who are uncomfortable with using this directed at them because they tend to feel like they're insulting them, even though this person has chosen to speak this way and to be referred to this way. But yeah, so yes, if somebody uses it, it is probably because they like it.
I think what is interesting when we compare Czech and, for example, English, is that in Czech, not only gender is grammaticalized, but also politeness strategies.
Yes.
And this also is lacking in English. So, for example, if the Czech people decide for the they pronoun, like the plural third person, it conflicts with the politeness strategy, at least in the old version of Slovak or Czech language, people would go for they if they wanted to be polite.
Yes.
So it's another layer also.
This is actually one rather viable strategy that works better in Slovak than it does in Czech, in which you would speak to somebody in formal language, because it is easier to sound gender neutral in the formal version of the language. However, this still leaves first person speech open to involuntary genderedness, which I suppose could be as a crazy idea subverted by using the royal we, which technically sounds a little funny, but since in trying to invent gender neutral language somewhere where it doesn't exist, you're kind of cooking out of nothing, you might as well try the royal we.
So, do we have any more questions, comments? Here or online? Okay, so now we will move on then to our second